Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you. So, as the introduction said, I'm going to present a part of my PhD research where I actually look at how we can uncover the ethics and the politics of technology, okay, how it's embedded in the technology itself using the case study of Airbnb. Okay, but I actually don't have a background in philosophy, but I ended up doing my PhD in philosophy, so I have to start with a very philosopher thing like to do, and this is to talk terminology. Because I have two key terms in my research that I use differently than how you usually use it when we talk about the sharing economy. The first one is value. Okay, so when I'm talking about value, I don't talk about monetary value, income, things like that, but rather moral and political values. Things like fairness, autonomy, freedom, democracy. And the same goes for politics. When I talk about politics, I don't mean the day-to-day politics like regulation and policy, but I actually look at the domain of how power is distributed in society and how social order is produced. Okay, so it's a different level of abstraction. Now, looking at the connection between values in politics and technology is a bit contested, also in philosophy. On the one hand, the one extreme is a so-called neutrality thesis, but basically says that technology is completely neutral. Okay, it all comes down to how we as persons or as society use it. A phrase that's well-known, connected to it, is guns don't kill people, people kill people. But if you look at these two pieces of technology, these Hello Kitty products, so if you look at the gun, for example, when you hold a gun in your hand, you have certain ideas of what you're going to do with it, which is shooting people. And it doesn't matter if you do it for self-defense or an act of aggression. There's something in the design of the gun that already promotes or had affordances for you to use it in certain ways. And if we compare it to the other Hello Kitty technology here, the bike, you probably have the idea, okay, maybe my little sister will ride it with it to school, but you don't think about how you're going to kill people with it. Okay, so there are certain affordances in a technology design that influence our use of it. But from here to say, okay, so there's some values that are implemented or embedded in the technology's design, to say that technologies have politics is still a bit of a leap. But if we look at this bench, a very simple piece of technology, this is a picture I took in Tel Aviv, and I think you all know this homeless hostile design, okay? This armrest is not there for some person to rest their one arm in the middle of the bench. It's there so that homeless people wouldn't be able to sleep on this bench. But if we take another example, you can actually build a bench in a way that invites homeless people to use it as a shelter. So the design of a simple technology as a bench could be very political by saying who can use public space and how, who is invited to use public space and who is excluded from that. Okay, and when we're going to look at digital technologies, it's of course a bit more complicated. And this is why I took the disclosive computer ethics method. This is a methodology that focuses on revealing the hidden ethics and politics, okay, things like the embedded values we talked about, and more political issues in morally opaque technologies and practices. So morally opaque basically says that the ethical issues and the political issues aren't as clear as, let's say, in the example of the gun. Now, it's not going to be a methodology talk. I'm just going to say it's a combination of technical investigations and philosophical analysis. If you want to hear more, we can chat afterwards, or I send you a few of my papers. And here are a few examples of case studies that we researched with this approach: facial recognition systems, plagiarism detection systems, search engines. I think you can see how Airbnb or sharing platforms fit in this list. So let's look at some findings. Let's start with the value of professionalism. Okay, so when we look at Airbnb's design, there are different ways in which it promotes the professionalism of hosts. A few examples is the algorithmic curation of the text and the photos in listings. This is the top screenshot that you see, automatically generated text. Also, there's a host dashboard. This is the bottom screenshot that professionalizes how hosts can manage the properties and the listings. There's also the option, for example, for automated communication. So the complete email communication between host and guest, welcome emails, goodbye emails, prepare your trip emails could be completely automated. So there's actually no real communication between them. And if we look at this example, so actually the platform design shapes the interactions between the users. It's also standardizes the Airbnb experience in ways that promotes Airbnb's hospitality vision. So actually, Airbnb moves away from this sharing economy narrative of underutilized resources and being a neutral marketplace. Okay, the second example is of trust, a big issue on the internet and in the sharing economy anyway. And if we look at Airbnb's review system, it has a lot of affordances so that people will give 4 to 5 stars review. One example you can see in the screenshots that actually during this workflow of leaving a review, 1 to 3 stars are always negative with the same parameters, and 4 and 5 stars are always positive with the same parameters. So there's no actual scala, there's only good and bad, which is always divert you towards 4 to 5 star reviews. It's also what I call double blind, which means that the host and the guest, they can't see each other's reviews until 14 days have passed. Okay, so there's this psychological pressure to leave a good review and not a realistic one. Also related to trust, Airbnb uses a lot of predictive analysis methods to monitor untrustworthy bookings and divert the guests into bookings which are more suitable in these cases. So again, here the platform design actually creates this kind of self-reinforcing dynamic of 4.5 to 5 star reviews, and there's a lot of empirical research that shows exactly this result. And it also promotes institutional trust. Okay, so trust in Airbnb as an institution or as a platform, but not really between the users themselves. And again here, Airbnb actually moves away from this sharing economy narrative of peer reviews that generate trust, or the platform only connects users without influencing the interaction. Now, the case of social well-being, also of value, is a bit more nuanced than that. One aspect of social well-being is actually the interpersonal and social ties between people. But when we look at how Airbnb mediates interaction, it actually depersonalizes them. Okay, the example of the automatic communication that I mentioned earlier, but also Airbnb heavily pushes the self-check-in and the use of lockboxes. Okay, you probably know them, these notorious lockboxes. At the entrance of the building, the guests get like a code, and then they get the keys to the apartment without even meeting the host. Another aspect of social well-being is actually the influence on indirect stakeholders. Okay, people actually don't use the app or Airbnb, which is in this case the neighbors. And here Airbnb has some technical measures to mitigate extreme cases. Okay, so parties in the flats, things like this, but they actually completely ignore the day-to-day burden of people who live in a house with Airbnb flats and tourists coming in and out of the house. A last example in this case is that in 2016, Airbnb faced some accusation about how the platform enables or facilitates the discrimination of people of color and people with certain gender identities by hosts. They won't rent them flats or rooms. And in this case, Airbnb took a different approach. They actually acknowledged the technology's role in this discrimination and did a process to change the platform as a technology and as an institution to mitigate and eliminate this kind of discrimination on the platform. So here, again, we can see that Airbnb moves away from this sharing economy narrative that collaborative consumption creates a social and interpersonal ties. But we have here a big exception of its anti-discriminatory work. Now, my last example here is the notion of non-ownership. Okay, so I argue that non-ownership is actually a central value in the sharing economy throughout all platforms. You probably all know this phrase that Uber doesn't own any taxis and Airbnb doesn't own any real estate. So it's this idea of non-ownership of assets and non-employment of labor also, but these platforms own the data and the algorithms. So this leads me to the conclusion that the algorithm and the data, they are actually power mechanisms in the hands of these platforms to promote the interest, to promote the social vision. And in Airbnb's case, it's Airbnb's vision of hospitality. Okay, so a few conclusions. I think it's the obvious from my talk is that ethical and political issues, they often extend beyond the general application. Okay, so it's not just about home sharing, it's how the platform mediates and orchestrates it that give rise to ethical issues and political ones. And the design choices, that they have more political implications, so the platforms aren't neutral intermediaries, as they usually claim, and that the platform algorithms are designed in ways that promote their social vision. And I think that these findings are also generalizable to mainstream platforms in general. First of all, because of Airbnb's normative impact on the sharing economy, but also when we connect it to the sharing economy narrative and see what's the tension there. And what we can do with these findings. So first of all, of course, it gives us a case to reinforce the platform's responsibility on the impact on individuals and society. It also helps us to repoliticize technology governance. Okay, so questions like which technologies we use for what and in which way are political issues that belong in the political public sphere. And also, we have all this talk about ethics for programmers and engineers, but when we look at digital technologies, there are much more people who are involved in this development. Okay, so we also need to think about ethics for product owners, for user experience, user interface designers, and Scrum Masters, maybe even more. Now to finish up, I did a similar research looking at platform cooperatives. Okay, so I did the same kind of analysis with Airbnb and with Co-op Cycle. And when I look at the differences between what I came up with, one thing that comes to mind is that the differences between these kind of platforms, again, as I mentioned earlier, they extend beyond not only the idea of the general application. So not just the home sharing, it's actually how platform cooperatives are built differently in ways that differently mediate this whole interaction between users and between the platform and society that give rise to other ethical and political implications. So this leads me to the conclusion that we also need to think beyond regulation. Okay, we need to think about how we democratize technology, things like co-determination of the design process, public and co-ownership of technology, and public support for democratic technologies, open source, etc. And that's it. Thank you.
Now you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Okay. One moment.
Thank you. What do you think are the source of those designs and those political value that they endorse? Like, do you think it was the founder's idea from the start, or maybe because the sharing economy became less business opportunity, less of a business of opportunity? Because every platform are naturally going to end up like this at some point.
Well, it's a good question. I couldn't say exactly what the source, but when you look at Airbnb, they did start up still mostly with this idea of, okay, if you have a spare room or if you're going on vacation, you can sublet your apartment, but somewhere along the way it shifted. Okay, and there's probably a lot to do with the political economy behind it, the VC, the venture capital that's invested. So the investors want to get more money out of it, and all these capitalist platforms at the end they have to make profits. So they have to go in this direction of monetizing everything and commodifying everything and becoming bigger, which comes on the expenses of ethical deliberations, or they have to actually say goodbye to this sharing economy narrative. So it's more of the system that pushes many platforms in this direction. Of course, also the founders or the owners that have their own interest. But when I looked at platform cooperatives, there you can really see that they are aware of this tension, that when they scale up, they have to let go of some values, and most of them actually stop scaling in order to keep the values. So there is something fundamentally different when the platform is owned by the workers and the users and themselves and not VC.
Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah, I had a question regarding perhaps what would you suggest as an alternative, not to fall again in sort of individual consumer choice about platforms, and sort of how we could think about cooperatives beyond me, single individual, choosing for a product. What would you think? I mean, this goes beyond regulation, but no.
Well, beyond the personal choices of not renting in Airbnb, which is the obvious, opting out for platform cooperatives if you want to engage in this kind of sharing economy and of this home sharing and everything. So there is for Airbnb. There are also other less official platforms. For example, I travel a lot to Tel Aviv, to Israel, because this is where I come from, and there's like a whole marketplace on Facebook of people really subletting the apartments while they're on vacation. And this is where I look for sublets and not Airbnb, for example. But of course, it's also a political question. This is why I mention it. Like, okay, how we can, as a society, promote this kind of technologies which are democratic, which are more invested in a local community. And this is things we need good policies for.
Yeah, that's what I kind of pointed out, sort of beyond regulation in terms of policy. What would you say?
So beyond regulation, the way I see it, you have like kind of two pillars. On the one hand, you have to break the power of big platforms, which is probably more on EU level, not something that we can influence directly, but also locally promote local platforms or local initiatives. For example, when you look at smart city, now in Berlin we have a different government, but the less government, which was more left-wing leaning, they did try to go more in the direction of not selling out the city to Google and co.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering what is the role of the other users actually? So you focus very much on the role of the platform. So what is the role, let's say, in all of these developments of the Airbnb hosts or the guests?
Good question. I can only partially answer it because my focus was actually really looking at the technology's role. This is why I kind of left out of scope the role of the users and how they interact with that. But I always came across these kind of things. There are also a lot of my data is based on also secondary literature that looked at how hosts or guests perceive certain things in the platform's design. For example, I have a lot of hosts which are actually still subscribed to this idea of the sharing economy, of renting out a room in the apartment and all this kind of stuff. They feel really either neglected or discriminated by the platform because all these affordances, and I have much more in my research, they actually align with the interests of multi-listers. People who have multiple properties that rent them out for money. So there's actually also a lot of this tension between the users themselves and the platform and who actually the platform represents.
First of all, thanks for this great presentation. I have a question because, in the media coverage, you could kind of see in interviews the strategic shifts actually which you described. They were actually explained by the founder. They would do it. They would focus more on professional professional providers and so on. And if I'm not mistaken, recently they actually said the opposite. They want to go back to their roots. They want to go back more to these real experiences, because they wouldn't, at least from my argument, from my awareness, they wouldn't argue that it's more towards the sharing economy, but more this unique experience. That's what the users are searching for, and so on. Can you see that, or is this for you like just a coverage of their shift towards professional hosts?
Well, in my research, in my findings, I couldn't see it. For me, as long as I don't see it, it's more of marketing talk. I didn't show this slide, but I also looked at democracy and co-determination in my research. But from the findings I had is actually that also the new design features. Just now, when was it? Airbnb autumn-winter release, I think it was around October. And the list of the new features, they actually still align with the interests of multi-listers. They don't align with the interests of small-scale hosts. This is why I said the privileged multi-listers and disadvantaged normal small-scale hosts. It's a slide I didn't show. So I still don't see any democratization tendency or any tendency in Airbnb of rolling back. Maybe we'll be surprised in 1 or 2 years, but I don't see it in my findings.
Are there more questions? Give me a hand sign.
You explained that there was this one, now I'm missing the word. There was this one case with the racial discrimination where they wanted to make a special effort and a special initiative to kind of fight that. Do you know why this was the issue where they actually decided to do something different? And was it because of social pressure, or what moved the needle there?
Well, I do know there was a lot of social pressure back then. 2016, it was also a completely different time period, and most of the pressure was in the US context, which was the context where Airbnb was very strong back then, but not as strong in the rest of the world. So I can only assume it has financial background of, waiting and saying, okay, of course we want to promote ourselves as an inclusionary platform, so people will feel safe here to rent and everything. And you can see it throughout tech companies in all of Silicon Valley, not just Airbnb. This tendency of diversity, yes. Everything else like social injustice, all this other stuff, less. So I will put it under this category.
Thank you. Are there more questions in the audience? Yes.
Did you confront Airbnb with the research? No. And there was no reaction so far because it's published, right?
This part of the research isn't published yet. I held a few talks, so let's see, but it will be published in the next year. But I don't think Airbnb will take interest in my research.
Anyone else has a question?
Thank you for this presentation. Actually, I'd like to hear if you are aware of any regulatory experience, at least at the municipal level, regarding real estate platforms, because you can consider these platforms as infrastructures, like James Mulder says in the Platform Socialism book, for instance. So do you have any experience like state level, municipal level regulations towards real estate platforms?
Do you mean regulating platforms like Airbnb, or regulation in terms of making these platforms part of the infrastructure?
Yeah, the second one. Yeah, but specifically to Airbnb case, to housing platforms, at the municipal level.
Okay, so regarding the first case, you probably know a lot of cities, also Berlin, have this cap or regulation on how much you can sublet apartments, and you should get a registration and everything, which was something that Airbnb ignored for 5 years. For example, in Berlin, it was introduced 2018. Only now this year, Airbnb implemented it in a platform that they check if you have this registration. But that's for that. I still don't know on any active regulation about cities, municipalities thinking about implementing these platforms as part of the infrastructure. I know there's like high-level talk in politics or in certain parts of politics more left-wing leaning. When you think about smart cities and which platforms operate in the city and things like this, to take it more in the direction of cooperative platform or city-owned platform or union-owned platform, but it's mostly talk. There's no real substantial regulation that I know of.
Just to add a comment, that in Brazil we have an example of a city-level platform for car sharing and deliveries. So I was wondering that maybe it would be quite relevant for housing as well. We can talk later.
Yeah, it's true.
If there's another quick question, we can do like a last one. I don't see a hand. So thank you very much
Thanks
for this talk.